Welcome to this installment of the Conversations with the Master series for the Consultants Training Institute, featuring a conversation with Richard Wise. Richard is a partner specializing in business valuation and litigation matters for MNP's office in Montreal, Canada. He has served as president for the Canadian Institute of Chartered Business Valuators. He is an international governor for the American Society of Appraisers and serves as the chair for the American Society of Appraisers Business Valuations Standards Subcommittee. He has served as a valuation expert for the Canadian Revenue Agency, the Attorney General of Ontario, and the Quebec Financial Markets Authority. Please enjoy this conversation with Richard Wise. I'm Richard. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
I like your style. We look pretty similar here today.
Well, maybe go to the same haberdasher.
I think it looks good. Again, thank you for letting us spend some time with you to talk about your career and your contributions to the valuation and financial forensic professions.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
So how did you get into the industry? What excited you about it that you decided this would be your career path?
Well, I'm from Canada, but I'm very involved in the U.S. valuation profession, as you can see. And in the early 1970s, Canada adopted a capital gains taxation system. And that gave rise to business valuation requirements.
Okay.
So that all businesses and interests in businesses and other assets had to be valued effectively at the beginning of the new tax system, and that would be the cost basis for any capital gains tax in the future. You had to have a cost. So if I bought something in 1968 and it had a certain value at what we call V-Day, then any capital gains measuring or starting from V-Day going forward would be in the tax base.
Okay.
The pre-V-Day gains were exempt, so there was no retroactivity. Having said all that, the accounting firms recognized right away the need for valuation practitioners, and so did the Canada Revenue Agency, which is the Canadian version of the IRS.
Okay.
And the profession really began in the early 1970s in Canada and mushroomed to what it is now. It's a very major profession, as it is in the United States. Mm-hmm. And indeed, we have a lot of cross-border sharing. We have joint conferences between the Americans and the Canadians in business valuation. Every 4 years since 1986, the American Society of Appraisers and the Canadian Institute of Chartered Business Valuators have had joint advanced business valuation conferences. So it's something which, as I mentioned, had mushroomed. It started with taxation in Canada, and then in the mid-1970s, there were major changes to the corporate law statutes affecting minority shareholders and their right to have an appraisal or dissent remedy, which gave rise to valuation requirements for corporate purposes, oppression remedy. And then there were new changes in Canada involving matrimonial laws. So various areas, whether it's taxation, corporate law, matrimonial law, eminent domain, damages quantification, all these areas required the services of a business appraiser or a business valuator. And then there's a lot of M&A activity, Canada, United States. There's many American corporations are parent companies of Canadian subsidiaries. And also you have Canadian parent companies that acquire American subsidiaries. So you have cross-border valuation requirements. Okay. So I got involved in that as well. So the kind of work that I was doing, I was a partner of Deloitte & Touche. I wrote the valuation manual for that firm in Canada, and I was the partner in charge until 1980. But there was all this cross-border work as well as the domestic work that had to be done in the field of business appraisal, business valuation. And that's how I got involved. And then I set out on my own. I started my own firm in 1979, 1980. As what we call a boutique firm, just a small firm, and we grew to 12 people. And then just last year, the seventh largest accountancy firm in Canada, called MNP, for Myers, Norris, Penny,
Okay.
acquired our firm. We merged into that firm, and now I'm part of the MNP firm in Canada, which has 3,000 people, 65 offices. It's over 60 years old and has 475 partners and gross revenues in excess of $400 million. So now I'm part of that big firm that's and it's affiliated with a worldwide organization called Praxity, and a group of accounting firms, and there are many in the United States and Europe. So that's what's happening. But I'm a past president of the Canadian Institute of Chartered Business Valuators. And when I took over the presidency, I recognized right away that we had to be credible and to have valuations that would be meaningful, recognized by the financial community, the business community, by the courts, because there's a lot of litigation in valuation matters. There'd have to be standards.
Sure.
There'd have to be a code of ethics, rules of professional conduct. So as president, I did the best I could and try to move ahead with standards. And the Americans started in the 1980s as well, and I've been on the ASA, American Society of Appraisers, Business Valuation Committee for about 22 or 23 years. I'm also a certified valuation analyst with NACVA, and I'm an MCBA with the Institute of Business Appraisers. So I monitor the standards of all these societies,
Right.
and I've been on a few committees with Mark Kuchik and as well as Mark Hansen, and looking at the potential standardization or harmonization of the various standards. But one thing we did discover was there are no conflicts. The standards of the AICPA, the NACVA, the IBA, the Canadians, ASA, there are no conflicts. So we're all, but some are more detailed than others.
Sure. Why is there, from a practitioner perspective, why is the issue of standards an area that valuators really truly need to focus their practice on? We find that they love the technical stuff, how to calculate the discounts and premiums, what's involved in the cost of capital, what case law do we need to be governed by for these engagements. But the area of standards sort of underlies all of those issues. What would be your advice to folks coming into this profession, and even those who've been in it for a while, to constantly be aware of the need for standards as part of their work?
Well, the standards, I mean, there are many reasons why we'd want to have standards, but standards also help the public trust in what we're doing. If we have professional standards the same way as doctors or lawyers, CPAs, there are standards, and these are the, let's say, our minimum standards that should be followed by practitioners to make sure that there's integrity in the work we do, there's credibility, that work is being done in conformity with the expectations of the public and those relying and using reports, such as the government, such as clients, such as advisors to business and to industry. It's important to have a proper level playing field where, again, like we all know, you want to see a doctor. Well, we're satisfied that the doctor, who's a member of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, follow standards, and we would be afraid to go to a doctor who didn't have to comply with standards and professional issues like that. And with lawyers as well, there are standards, and same with the business appraisal profession. So it ensures public trust and the proper conduct of the work that's being done, and that's and that there's integrity, as I mentioned before, and that's very important. Again, I'll even go to the courts, because business appraisal now is something you can't stay away from the courts, in effect. You may say, well, look, I don't do court work. I'm just going to do a business appraisal in connection with tax planning, estate planning, succession planning. Fair enough. So you do an appraisal, a business appraisal, in connection with a tax plan or an estate plan or reorganization. 3 years later, the IRS challenges that value. And your client gives you a call and says, hey, we have a problem. The IRS doesn't accept it. Their valuators in the IRS valuation group don't agree that the value is XYZ. And it's being debated, it's being contested, and it ends up where you are in a courtroom defending your valuation, not because your client is attacking you, it's the IRS is not accepting that value, and it may mean, say, $1 million in extra taxes your client has to pay.
Right.
And now you find yourself before a judge of the U.S. tax court, and you're defending your valuation. You're trying to, against the valuation or the appraisal prepared by the IRS valuation engineer. And now the debate goes on in the courtroom. Right. So you never intended to have it for litigation purposes, but your valuation ends up being what's called an expert's report. So, and filed in a courtroom, and it could be for anything else as well. You may be doing a valuation for a shareholder, and there's a dispute, and you're brought into the courtroom where it's being contested, and you have to give evidence before a trier of fact, a judge, and there's your opponent on the other side who's going to say the opposite thing, and you have a cross-examiner who's going to try to destroy your. One thing, if you have standards, at least the starting point is that the work was done pursuant to the professional standards promulgated by the profession, and that if one's peers were reviewing that, the peers would, let's say, agree that proper standards were applied. They might not agree, as you mentioned, on the discount rate,
right,
on the equity risk premium, on some of the judgmental factors, but that's okay. That's what this is about. This is judgmental and subjective, but to apply the proper standards, no one can. In other words, if there's negligence, it's not even with a doctor. If a doctor did what he or she was supposed to have done, and a patient, was an adverse effect, there's not much of a case against the doctor if the work done was proper. But if the standards were not applied, then there's you have negligence, that kind of thing.
I wonder if most of our members, credentialed members, not necessarily with the NACVA or any of the credentialing organizations, truly know what goes on behind the scenes with the organizations to collaborate, to discuss, to debate, all of the factors involved with coming to a harmonization of standards or keeping them separate. Can you talk a little bit about the organizations, the task forces, the groups that are working diligently behind the scenes to come together on this very important issue?
Well, it's a very good question. There is much more cooperation and collaboration among the professional standards setters and committees and subcommittees. We want to make sure that things, and for credibility purposes, that things are being uniform as much as possible. And it so happens, just on a much larger scale, because I've been talking about IBA and NACVA and AICPA and so forth, but there's a group also, the International Valuation Standards Council, which is based in London, England, which has liaison with the Americans and the Canadians, where on a global basis, we're looking at global standardization. So submissions are being made by the American valuation societies and the Canadians, and there's cooperation. Like right now, I'm now chair of the ASA Business Valuation Standards Subcommittee, but I just replaced 8 or 9 months ago Chris Mercer, who was the chair, but now he's on the Professional Standards Board of the IVSC, of the International Valuation Standards Council in London. So there is this communication, the liaising among the various groups. There's also another group that's come to North America recently called RICS, or the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. They now are looking much more at business valuation. They were really real estate appraisers or surveyors, or what they're called in England and the rest of the world. They're in about 60 countries, maybe more than that, but several dozen countries, and they have about 150,000 members, not all accredited. Okay. But there's some very prominent business valuators in the United States who are active in the local American valuation scene who are also members of RICS.
Okay.
And I myself am a member of RICS.
Okay.
So we're staying on top of it all the time, and all of us stay, and we all have a common interest. In other words, people in NACVA and IBA, and they're related, so they have the same standards, and the AICPA and ASA, we're interested in following what each other is doing and staying on the same level playing field. It makes much more sense and ensures public confidence in what we're doing. So the study that we did, and the we is being Mark Cusick and Mark Hansen and myself, we looked at all the standards of the organizations I just mentioned,
okay,
and we saw there was no conflict whatsoever. Some of the organizations didn't have or didn't address certain issues, but that's okay. But there was nothing of a conflicting nature whatsoever. Some which were much more detailed, and the NACVA and IBA are more detailed in some respects than ASA, and the AICPA are the most detailed.
Okay.
But many, as you know, members of NACVA are CPAs, so
Sure.
they're going to follow the major organizations' standards. So. And we try to tell the members and the public what we're doing. So in various newsletters coming from the respective organizations, we will say that we have a new standard, new exposure draft has been issued. It will be circulated among the members for public comment. There's also the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, so-called USPAP. Only ASA is subject to USPAP, but nonetheless, when one looks at best practices, sometimes a standard might not be, there may be no standard, let's say, in this organization's books, but one might look to what's called, quote, best practices, unquote. Well, then you look at other organization standards, and they may say, well, if another respectable organization has promulgated a certain standard, and this particular practitioner abided by that standard, well, fine, even though it's, it's what, as I say, it's called best practices.
Right.
And a lot of the organizations are coming out not only with standards, but they're coming out, let's say, with practice guidelines, practice aids, procedural guidelines, advisory opinions. So it's, we use standards, but it goes much beyond that. And I call that what are best practices. Okay. And if your own peers are doing a certain thing, and it's generally accepted and it makes sense, and you've done that, then really there's nothing wrong. I mean, you've been in compliance, even though there's not a written, codified standard. Okay. So there's a lot of action taking place there, and the governments, and various governments are requiring this. The SEC in the States. Right. In Canada, the Ontario Securities Commission, which is like the SEC, has recognized the standards promulgated by the Canadian Institute of Chartered Business Valuators. The SEC is recognizing NACVA, NACVA, IBA, AICPA, and the Canada Revenue Agency has stated in a written document that its members follow the CICBV standards in Canada, and I know there was a case in the United States where the judge ruled in favor of the experts who were complying with USPAP, whereas the other expert for the IRS, who had a PhD and was a good economist and everything else, he did not conform to any standards, and the court preferred the two experts who were relying on USPAP. Standards, yeah. So in many different walks of life, it's very important to have those kinds of standards. And also when I'm reviewing a report prepared by another professional, and I know that professional is a member of an organization, a standard-setting body, I feel much more comfortable. I don't feel comfortable where there's no standard-setting body and one can do whatever he or she wishes until challenged.
Right. What areas do you specialize within your practice?
In my practice, I do a lot of litigation, consulting, and expert testimony in court, in shareholder disputes, dissent remedy, appraisal remedy, oppression remedy, damage quantification, eminent domain, matrimonial, and quantification of lost profits, intellectual property infringement, a lot of merger and acquisition work, a lot of tax planning, cross-border, Canada-U.S. tax, and local tax planning where fair market value is something that has to be dealt with, or tax appeals where the government doesn't agree with a tax opinion, valuation tax opinion, and we'll defend it and take it to court. Going public, sometimes an IPO, they need evaluation done. Going private, we do fairness opinions, whether a transaction is fair from a financial point of view to the shareholders, which is not a valuation, but it's a fairness opinion. So that's the kind of work we do, and we do a lot of writing and lecturing and conference presentations and things like that. So that fills up our time in the business appraisal area.
Diverse array of services. You stay busy, I'm certain, not only with your volunteer time to the profession in the area of standards. What do you do when you're not busy working?
Well, I like to travel. Until recently, I liked to ski, but I've got a bit of a hip problem, so the doctor told me to slow down and just stay away from the. So I used to like skiing. I like wine. I do community work. Well, I'm on the board of directors of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. I was recently on the board of directors of the Cancer Research Society. I'm on the board of governors of Dawson College in Montreal, and I was on the board of directors of St. George's School of Montreal. I have young kids, and I'm probably the oldest parent in the school, so at the time, I felt, well, how am I going to really get involved? The kids don't really have time to tell me about very much, so I said, I'll get on to the board of directors, and this way I can keep abreast of what's happening in the school, how many students there are to a teacher, and things like that. So I was on the board there, and a few other charitable organizations and so forth. So I like doing community work. It's something that I came from a home where my father was very active as well, so I grew up in a home that felt that there's a lot of work that can be done to help people in the community and so forth. So I've been doing that, and I do a lot of teaching and writing. I write a lot of articles and publish a lot of articles. I do this mainly on planes. So I just got back from London earlier this week, in fact. I got back from London this past Wednesday morning. Today's Friday. But the 7-hour flight between London and Washington en route back to Montreal, I wrote an article. So I didn't sleep. But it was great. The phone wasn't ringing.
Right.
And it was quiet.
It was a quiet time. What's your favorite place to travel to?
Well, I have a place in Florida. And being from Montreal, where we have a heck of a winter, I go there with the family Christmas time to bond. So I go with my wife and children. We go there for the March school break as well. And we're on the ocean, and we love it. And it's a nice change from Montreal. We used to have a cottage up on the lake up north, and I used to go there. And I was water skiing until about 8-9 years ago. I was still water skiing. So those are all nice recreations, and being with the kids as well. So that's a lot of fun. And I try to keep busy, but the family is extremely important. No matter what, it's all this is done with the blessing of my wife and kids, but they're always included as much as possible. I still get home for dinner every night, and I don't, and I say goodbye to everybody in the morning and that kind of thing.
Richard, thank you so much for your service.
My
to
pleasure.
The profession. It's an area that is as important as any, and probably unappreciated as to the value that it adds, not only to the practitioners but to the consumers of valuation services. It's a pretty big deal.
Well, look, we try our best, and I must say that the people I work with and the people I speak at conferences with and serve on committees with, they are terrific, and they make all this possible.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
For your time.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us for this installment of the Consultants Training Institute's Conversations with the Masters series featuring Richard Wise. We'll see you next time.